In November of 1903, a man signed a treaty in Washington. He was not a president, a minister, or anyone elected by anyone. He was a French engineer named Hay Bunau Varilla, who had bought shares in a failed company and who that day negotiated, on behalf of a republic barely 3 weeks old, the rights to the most coveted strip of land in the Western Hemisphere. Panama had just broken away from Colombia, and before its own delegates could reach the American capital, the treaty was already signed. That detail, small as it seems, says more about the canal than any engineering figure ever could. Panama's isthmus has a peculiar shape on a map. It's a narrow bridge between two enormous bodies of water, a sliver of land connecting two continents and separating two oceans by just about 50 miles. That position made it a strategic prize long before anyone thought about building a canal. As far back as the 16th century, the Spanish were crossing the isthmus to move Peruvian silver toward Europe. There was no shorter route. Whoever controlled that passage controlled a crucial piece of colonial trade. The isthmus was never just geography. It was political leverage in the shape of land, and empires knew it. The ambition to connect the two oceans artificially is almost as old as the colonial traffic across that route. For centuries, empires and merchants speculated about the possibility of opening a navigable passage. The logic was straightforward. Ships traveling from the Atlantic to the Pacific had to go all the way around the southern tip of South America, round Cape Horn, face violent storms, and add weeks to the journey. A canal through the isthmus would cut that distance dramatically. For trade, for war, for naval power, that route was worth any effort and justified any cost. The first serious attempt came from Ferdinand de Lesseps, the French engineer who had built the Suez Canal, and who arrived in Panama in 1880, carrying an enormous reputation and perhaps too much confidence. His plan was to dig a sea-level canal, no locks, just as he had done in Egypt. The problem was that Panama was not Egypt. The terrain was rugged, wet, and dense with jungle. Rains flooded excavation cuts. Landslides wiped out weeks of progress. And on top of all that, disease. Yellow fever and malaria tore through the workforce with brutal efficiency. Between 20 and 30,000 people died during the French attempt. The exact numbers were never firmly established. There were too many bodies and too few records. Lesseps' company accumulated debts, scandals, and corpses. Technical reports were falsified to keep investors confident. When the company collapsed in 1889, taking the savings of hundreds of thousands of small French shareholders down with it, the fallout shook the Third Republic and triggered one of the largest corruption trials of the 19th century. Back in the Panamanian jungle, rusted machinery, unfinished trenches, and the memory of thousands of nameless dead were all that remained. But the failure didn't erase the idea. It just left it open. And it was the United States that picked up what the French had left behind. By the end of the 19th century, Washington was an expanding power with growing commercial interests in the Pacific, a navy that needed to move between oceans, and a strategic doctrine that claimed influence over the entire American continent. The war against Spain in 1898 had handed the United States Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Controlling an interoceanic route under its own authority became a concrete priority, not just an abstract goal. The problem was that Panama was part of Colombia, and Colombia would not accept the terms Washington was offering. The Colombian Senate rejected the agreement in 1903, arguing that the terms were unfavorable to its sovereignty and to its own interests in the canal corridor. That rejection infuriated President Theodore Roosevelt, who saw the canal as an urgent strategic necessity. At that point, Panamanian separatist interests, the remnants of the French company, and American diplomacy found a different path forward. In November of 1903, Panama separated from Colombia. The process was quick and largely bloodless, partly because the American Navy positioned off the coastline prevented Colombian troops from landing to put down the revolt. Washington recognized the new state within 3 days. And before the month was over, the Hay Bunau Varilla Treaty was signed. Bunau Varilla handed the United States control over a 10-mile-wide strip on each side of the canal route, in perpetuity, with rights equivalent to those of a sovereign power. Panama received $10 million and an annual payment. The territory that would define its existence as a nation was placed, from its very first days, under foreign jurisdiction. American construction began in 1904 and lasted a decade. Engineer George Goethals ran the project with something close to military authority. But before a single ton of earth was moved, Dr. William Gorgas fought a different battle, eliminating yellow fever and controlling malaria in the zone. He applied strict sanitation measures, drained swamps, fumigated homes, and destroyed mosquito breeding grounds with a thoroughness that completely transformed the health conditions of the region. That work came first, and it made possible what the French had never been able to sustain. What followed was enormous. Hundreds of millions of cubic meters of earth were moved. Concrete locks were built on a scale that had no precedent. Lake Gatun was created, one of the largest artificial lakes in the world at the time. But behind all that machinery were tens of thousands of migrant workers from the Caribbean, mostly from Barbados and Jamaica, who dug, hauled, blasted, and died in numbers that official records were slow to acknowledge. Their names rarely appeared in the accounts written at the time. Inside the Canal Zone, racial hierarchy was written directly into employment contracts. White workers, mostly American, were paid in gold and given better housing, separate hospitals, and different living conditions. Black Caribbean workers were paid in silver, housed in separate barracks, and assigned the hardest and most dangerous jobs. The system was informally called the Gold Roll and the Silver Roll. It was segregation with an administrative label, a technical feat of modernity built on a colonial inequality that no one bothered to hide. The canal opened in August of 1914. The world barely noticed, because that same month the First World War began in Europe. The steamship Ancon was the first vessel to make the official crossing. Global shipping routes changed permanently. What had once required weeks of dangerous sailing around the southern tip of the continent now took hours. The impact on commerce, naval logistics, and American military reach was immediate. For Washington, the canal was exactly what Roosevelt had wanted, a strategic key at the center of the hemisphere. For Panama, the reality was more complicated. The canal existed on its territory, but it did not belong to Panama. The Canal Zone was an enclave administered by the United States, with its own laws, its own authorities, its own stores and schools. It was a state within a state. For decades, that presence shaped Panama's domestic politics, constrained its foreign relations, and fed a nationalism that grew precisely because the most visible source of national pride was, at the same time, the country's deepest wound. Tensions were frequent and persistent. In January of 1964, a dispute over the right to fly the Panamanian flag in the zone escalated into confrontations that left dozens dead. That episode marked a turning point in the relationship between the two countries. The pressure to renegotiate control of the canal became politically unavoidable. General Omar Torrijos made sovereignty over the canal the central axis of his political project. In 1977, he signed the Torrijos-Carter treaties with President Jimmy Carter, establishing a timeline for the gradual transfer of the canal to Panama. The process took more than 20 years. On December 31, 1999, at midnight, The Panamanian flag rose over the canal for good. The handover to the Panama Canal Authority happened without fanfare, almost as if time had quietly settled what negotiations had taken decades to work out. What remained is not simply a waterway between two oceans. It is also the question of how a country can be born already compromised, how the infrastructure that defines a nation can spend nearly a century as the clearest proof of what that nation does not control. The Panama Canal connected routes and shortened distances, but it also made plain how power operates when it is exercised over small territories in strategic positions, through unequal treaties, exploited labor, and sovereignty handed over before the country signing it fully understands what it is giving away. That logic was not unique to Panama. It has been, and continues to be, one of the most enduring ways the continent has negotiated its place in the world.